Hi, I'm Joe and welcome to the channel. In this micro lesson, I wanted to talk about how to play a guitar solo without thinking about scales. How would we even accomplish that? How would we go about doing that? Well, there's two key concepts in my opinion. One is targeting the chord tones, and the second one is what I like to call exploiting the natural voice leading that happens in a chord progression. One of my all-time favorite guitar solos, and I think what makes a great example for this, is the song Late for the Sky by Jackson Browne. David Lindley plays an incredible solo. If you're not familiar with it, please look it up. But it really outlines these key concepts that I want to share in this micro lesson. Hey, if you're new to the channel and you find any value in this video whatsoever, please do me a favor and consider supporting the channel for free by subscribing down below. Let's go ahead and jump into the micro lesson. So the entire concept for this video actually came out of an exercise that I was doing. I was trying to analyze, why do I like this guitar solo so much? What are the note choices that David Lindley is making? What chord tones is he landing on that I like so much that I can incorporate in my own playing? So when we think about crafting a solo, I think the first step we need to take is, let's go ahead and write out the chord progression. So that's exactly what I did. I wrote out the chord progression. I grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil and I did that. And then on top of the chords, I basically put all of the other notes that make up a chord and I stacked it on top of the root. So sorry, forgive the ugly handwriting. But basically I just took the root notes along the bottom and then I built each chord on top of it. So basically what I'm doing is I'm identifying every single chord tone for every chord in the progression. You might say to yourself, well Joe, I don't know the theory behind that. I don't know the root, third, and fifth formula to do that. That's okay. I actually made a video on this. I can put one of those cards up here for you to look at. But even if you don't know that, basically look where your fingers are landing when you're making these chords and just identify the notes that you're playing and write them down. Now we have kind of a map of all the target chord tones that we want to hit in our solo. And that's great, but how do we go from one to the other? Well, that's where the voice leading part comes in. So we have our chord progression, and we know that each chord basically has its own set of voices, its own set of notes that make it up. Well, voice leading is referring to how those individual voices from each chord, those individual voices, how they move from chord to chord. So a really good example of voice leading is a cliche line that you might have heard 1,000 times, from a G major chord to a G major 7 chord to a G7 chord to C. So inside of those chords, we heard on the top, you heard that little melody inside of there, and that's voice leading. Now in classical music and jazz music, there's sometimes some strict rules regarding voice leading. But the basic premise is this: what is the most conservative move that you can make when you go from one chord to the other? So basically when you're looking at each of your chord tones, when you go to the next chord, what is the minimal movement that you can make? Is it a half step? Usually there's no large leaps is what I'm getting at. It's basically just kind of a step down or a step up, or nothing larger than like a third. So let's look at one of the rules that you might have in jazz music. If you look at your typical 2-5-1 chord progression, which let's do in the key of G again. So inside of that chord example, we can hear two things happening. One of the rules is that the 7th of the D minor 7 wants to resolve to the 3rd of the G chord. So that would be the C going to the B of the G chord. And we have the 3rd of the D minor 7 wanting to resolve to the 7th of the G7 chord. And we can actually hear that F wants to resolve to the E, the 3rd of the C. So knowing this, we can actually start to exploit the natural movements inside of each chord in our chord progressions to come up with our solos. So let's go ahead and give this a try. I'm going to reference obviously the chord chart that I made that had all the individual notes. And I'm looking at it and I'm trying to see where are the smallest movements between each chord that I can play. And you're not going for an amazing solo here. What you're trying to go for is train your ear to hear those inner voice moves, and also just jot down the ones that you like, which ones resonate with you. We can use these later as building blocks for our solo. So my chord progression is C major to G major to F major to C major again, but with an E in the bass, to D minor 7 to A minor to G and then to F. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the root note of the first chord, which is C, and see where does that voice lead me through the whole entire chord progression. And I'm going to stay on one string for this exercise. And the reason for that is I'm trying to think a little bit like a singer. You know, a singer doesn't have 6 sets of vocal cords. They only have 1 set of vocal cords to use. So I want to take that approach with this. And again, I'm not interested in the scales that I would be using here. What I am interested in is learning where does each note want to take me in this chord progression. So I'm going to go ahead and listen to the chord progression. Now I'm going to try the voice leading. So we saw there that I actually was able to go through the entire scale staying on one string, and the voices starting on the root kind of led me to the 3rd of the G, to the 3rd of the F, to the 5th of the C, to the 3rd of the D minor 7, to the 5th of the A minor, to the 5th of the G, and then to the 5th of this F chord. So we had this nice line. So let's go ahead and do that same exercise, but this time I'm going to start on the 3rd and see where that takes me. Now, what do we notice about that example? Well, in that case here, I was able to actually stay on the same note throughout different chords. So we saw that I started on the 3rd, like I said, and then went down to the 5th of the G, but then I was able to stay on this C because it was a common chord tone throughout the F, the C, the D minor 7, and the A minor. So I was able just to hang out there. And then I walked down to the 3rd of the G, down to the 3rd of the F. So that was a different type of voice leading where I wasn't changing notes on every single chord change. So I'm going to do the same exercise now, but with the 5th. And so these are the steps that you can take too when you're trying to craft your own solos. And again, what we're doing is along the way, we're jotting down and making notes of which moves sound really nice to us that we can again use as building blocks later on to build our solos. So let's hear what the 5th sounds like, starting on the 5th of the first chord. So starting on the 5th, I had a little bit of a variation of both starting on the root as well as starting on the 3rd, where I was able to kind of descend still, but in some cases I stayed on the same note. Now, you don't have to do that same exact type of formula. What you're going to do is you're going to experiment and see where you can go, because I may be able to start on one note and start descending, but I may start to be able to ascend again to find the closest note to the next chord. So let's go ahead and try an example similar to that. So in that case there, I was just trying to move around and stay in one area, but move to the next closest chord tone that I could find. So now once you go through this process and you've been taking notes, you have certain chord moves that you want to try to incorporate and bridge together to build your solos off of. And again, we're not thinking about scales at all. We're just using the chord tones to lead us to build that solo. And I have this concept. Remember to try to exhaust all possibilities. So, when we listen to David Lindley, he's not just staying on one note and he's kind of walking down, he's moving around. Start to add other notes into the mix, but make sure that when you make those key chord changes, that you're touching on those moves that you came up with that you liked when you're doing this exercise. And the other thing to do is this. Remember, start to add also your own style into this. You don't have to do what I was doing, which is just play individual notes. There's other ways to get into notes, right? We can slide into them, we can do vibrato like I was doing, and we can do bends into them. So let's try a little bit of an example of something like that, where we're trying to spice up those chord moves. So you heard in there I was trying to add some bends and some slides, but I was still keeping some of the basic moves that I liked inside of that solo. So some practice tips for you. Maybe start simple. Start with maybe a 2-chord vamp and do the same process. Write out your chords, write out all the notes that make up the chords, and then walk through starting on the root, then the 3rd, and then the 5th of the 1st chord, and trying to see where those voices lead you when you go to the next chord. And then, of course, spice things up. Start to add in a new chord. And then do the same exact process. And as you do this, it's a great ear training exercise because you're training your ear to hear those inner movements. And it's going to become second nature to you. But like everything else with the guitar, you have to make sure you put the time into this. And if you do put the time into this, I think you're going to find it's very rewarding. And soon you won't have to maybe rely so much on writing the notes out. You'll just be able to use your ear to guide you through a solo. And if you want to take this a step further, we've basically been using triads for this example, and maybe that's what's in your chord progression. But go ahead and substitute some of your chords out and embellish them a little bit. Put some tension or color notes in there. Maybe do like a sus chord or an add 9 chord. When you do that, guess what? Those tension notes, those color notes, now become available to you to use in your voice leading. So now you have a whole new palette to choose from when you're writing your solos. Well, Nash is excited. Another video down for this micro lesson series. If you found any value in it again, please do me a favor and consider supporting the channel for free by subscribing down below, hit the like button, and knock on the bell and you'll be notified when the next video comes out. As always, I wish you a wonderful day.